Welcome Adrian Freedman, to the Songwriter series. We're going to talk songwriting, more of like a conversation, and I'd like to start with some of your background and how you started, whether you had music in the family, and also did you, at one point, for example, did you know that you were going to be, when did you know you were going to be a musician? And that kind of thing. Could you give us a little bit of a background?
Well, it's funny the way you phrase that. When did I know I was going to be a musician? Because I never considered that I could be anything else, ever since I was old enough to think about such subjects. In fact, I was so completely immersed in the world of music that I couldn't understand why anyone else was doing anything else. I started playing music at a very young age. Started the piano when I was 5, because I went on my first day at school. There was a piano in the room and they couldn't keep me off it. And after a few weeks, the teacher said to my mum, "I think you better give him some lessons. Might be a little Mozart in there." So I didn't quite turn out the same as Mozart, but definitely there was a sense that music was in my blood. And I learned lots of instruments when I was a kid. I learned the violin as well. And when I was 9 years old, I became obsessed by the trumpet. And I started playing the trumpet, and it became my main instrument all through my teen years and into my 20s. I was playing a lot of jazz music and classical music as well. And then I became just drawn to all different kinds of music. I was like a magpie. I was curious about every kind of genre and style of music. So I was playing avant-garde music. I was interested in electronic music. I played drums in a punk band. I studied Baroque music and played the recorder in Baroque ensembles. I was playing jazz music, you name it. I just wanted to taste it all, really. And then I suppose I heard the shakuhachi, my main instrument, what became my main instrument. I was already in my kind of mid-20s when I first heard the shakuhachi, and that led me to Japan, where I lived for 7 or 8 years. And everything that I'd done previously, different styles, gradually settled into this one sort of approach to music, which is very much about the sort of feeling and the tone of the music rather than a particular style like jazz, classical.
And in terms of also your musical background, was there much music and song or singing, any of that around?
Well, my dad sang around the house incessantly. He didn't read music or play any musical instruments, but he knew hundreds of songs off by heart, and he was just singing all the time. And my mum, she was really interested in music, and she was actually my first recorder teacher, because she was the recorder teacher at my school when I was in the primary school. So I had that kind of interest, but none of them were remotely as involved as music as I came to be. And there was no active encouragement to be, "Oh, you should be a musician." They just supported me as much as they could as I developed my own interests.
But you had some study of composition as well.
Yeah, I went to Manchester University. When I left university, there was no question I would go on to study music. Nothing else that I could consider. It was a natural progression. And so, yeah, I studied classical music, and I majored in composition. And I had some classical composition teachers that are quite well known in their day, like Robert Saxton. And later I studied in France with Yannis Xenakis and Robin Walker, Jeff Poole. So I was in that world of classical contemporary music for some time. And the kind of mindset of the composer, where you're just really tuning into music in your own head and trying to get that on paper so that other people can play it, that was very much the sort of world that I was in. But I also loved improvising, and I loved very sort of free-form musical environments. In London, I lived in London for about 5 years when I did postgraduate music studies at the Guildhall School of Music. And while I was there, I was studying Baroque music, actually. But I became involved with the London Musicians Collective, which was all about totally free improvisation and sort of radical jazz and experimental music. So I've always felt this need to have my finger in various pies, I suppose, musical pies.
So coming to song and songwriting, how did that come into your life in terms of starting to receive, write, and that process? How did it happen?
Well, it's a very specific thing, and in a way, I feel that to be here in this series as the Songwriter series, when you asked me about it, I felt, well, I'm not a songwriter, but I do have lots of songs, and so that's a bit curious. What does that mean? So it's very much to do with the context in which the songs that I sing were received, and I use this word received because I am very familiar with what it means to compose music. And I only ever composed instrumental music. I wrote music for all different kinds of bands and ensembles and groups, and I played many instruments, but I never wrote any songs. Produced several albums and did hundreds of gigs and played in all kinds of musical groups, but never I wrote any songs. And then when I was in my sort of mid-30s, I became drawn into a particular kind of world of working with plant spirit medicines, which is a South American tradition that can be found in many other places around the world as well. And it's a way of sitting in ceremonial space with meditation and with prayer and with intentions of healing. And within that kind of context, music is very important. And I was drawn into this environment, not for musical reasons, but because I was at that point in my life, I was kind of on my knees having some kind of mental or emotional breakdown, I suppose, looking back. And I just was desperate for healing, and someone said, oh, you should try this group, this kind of healing ceremonies they're doing with medicine from the forest. And so I wasn't looking for that, but I just sort of was drawn into it for other reasons. And once I arrived there, I fell in love with the music. And the music was very, very simple, unlike anything I'd ever played before. Just like A minor, C, D, playing chords on the guitar, simple songs, repetitive, diatonic, like hymn tunes or children's nursery rhymes or sea shanties. And I was used to quite sort of sophisticated music where you study the subtle nuances of how to embellish a phrase in Baroque music or, you know, highfalutin avant-garde classical music. And suddenly I found myself in this environment where people are just strumming songs on the guitar and singing these very simple melodies. But it just went straight to my core. And in that context of a very devotional atmosphere, and in the vibration that we are sort of open to when we do these kinds of rituals with plant spirit medicines, I sort of perceived that this music was coming from some sort of source that was the same source as all the other music that I'd always loved. And I had this vision of a kind of fountain of music sprinkling down onto the earth, and then it lands in the 17th century on Bach, wearing his periwig and with his quill writing out his cantatas, and it lands on Miles Davis as he's finding his melodic way through. And it lands on all musicians of all stripes and cultures anywhere. They're all basically receiving this connection to some sort of, for want of a better word, divine source of sound. And it seemed to be the kind of connected to the spark of creativity, but much more than that, because the songs are not composed in a sort of creative way. Like as a musician, as an artist, creativity is very important. But what I started to feel in the context with these songs is that they kind of bypass creativity. It's more like listening to something that already exists in some dimension somewhere. And by listening and tuning in, the song just sort of appears, it materializes in your consciousness. And I think for a lot of people who receive songs like this, if they've never had any previous musical experience, it must be very different, because a lot of people who receive medicine songs, it's the first musical experience they've had, so they don't had that kind of context that I did of being a trained composer. But within my context, I could feel this is completely different. I'm not writing songs here. I'm listening to something that wishes to communicate itself to me. And whether that's from some a sort of other dimension, or whether it's some wisdom or poetry or insights arising from within me that the medicine is helping me to tune into, is open to interpretation. But anyway, that distinction between songwriting and receiving a song is something that is key to my relationship with my songs.
Because I think we've got quite a similar musical background in certain areas. Like for a moment, at the moment, there's a very strong Beatles theme around because the new film has come out, and they're a classic example where they were definitely receiving something, and they were channeling something for also the energy that was around at that time. But there was so I mean, and also my own personal experience where you almost like something comes through, and you almost like it's like surfing it. So there's an aspect of. There's a balance between that, and then of course for some things they just come straight through.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but I've been watching this new Peter Jackson documentary about the Beatles, and of course as a Beatles superfan I'm totally in love with it. But I do, just using that as an example, I do feel quite a difference between being in some kind of creative flow where you're receiving melodies, you're receiving ideas, but then you see, if you watch the way the Beatles work, they're kind of massaging that, they're sculpting it, they're trying out different words, they're trying out different rhymes, they're trying different riffs, they're waiting for it to fall into place, and it goes through different forms before it arrives in its final form. My experience of these medicine songs is something very different. They arrive fully formed, and there's no possibility of interference with my own sort of artistic, judgmental self that says this is good, this is bad, I'm going to go this way, not that way. And I received so many songs over the years, I began to filter how I was receiving them, because I began to sort of observe that actually sometimes my mind did try to interfere. And so I developed this practice of, if I received a song, I wouldn't write it down or record it. I'd wait till the next day to see if it remained intact inside me. Otherwise I'd be writing fragments down all the time and then trying to put them together in different ways to make songs. So I went through a period where I was very unclear about what was happening, whether I was being asked to, create this material in the way that the Beatles created their songs, as we can see in that documentary, by sort of, taking the raw material and allowing it with your own creative intention and your own sort of...
the crafting element.
The crafting, that's a good crafting, yeah. So there's no element of crafting in this, it's just listening and tuning in to what seems to want to be transmitted.
I think it's time to give an example of what you're talking about.
Well, the first song that I chose to sing today is a really good example of this, because it's a song called Rainha das Águas, which is a Portuguese language, and it means the Queen of the Waters. Now, the music that I was hearing initially when I was in these medicine circles was all in the Portuguese language, music from Brazil. And all the songs were in Portuguese, and I didn't understand it. But I became completely suffused, immersed in that music, because I fell in love with it. And so I would, in those days, all the music could only be found on cassette. So I was searching for these cassettes and exchanging music with people and studying it and learning it. And I became so deeply in that world. And after a couple of years, I guess I was kind of marinated in that world. I was so deeply kind of submerged in it almost. And then some elements of that started to arise through me, and I started to receive songs in Portuguese language before I could speak Portuguese. And so there's a really good example of how just being open and being available to these melodies and these teachings also that are contained in the songs comes through. So I'll sing the song. The words talk about the Queen of the Waters, the Queen of the Sea, the Queen of the stars that shine on the seashore, the Queen of the flowers, the beautiful Queen, white and crystal and blue, and the Queen of the Astral, the Queen of the Moon, the Queen of the Celestial, the pure Mother. She comes to heal all of us, the Queen Iemanjá. And Iemanjá is the name of the Orisha, who is the deity or spirit of the water in the actually African spiritual tradition, which became a strong element in Brazilian spiritual practices. So it's a song for Iemanjá. das águas, rainha do mar, rainha das estrelas que brilham na beira-mar, rainha das estrelas que brilham na beira-mar, rainha das águas, rainha do mar, rainha de todos, ela é quem vem nos curar, rainha Iemanjá, rainha Iemanjá, rainha Iemanjá, rainha das flores, rainha divinal, rainha dos primores, branca, azul e cristal, rainha dos primores, branca, azul e cristal, rainha das águas, rainha do mar, rainha de todos, ela é quem vem nos curar, rainha Iemanjá, rainha Iemanjá, rainha Iemanjá, rainha da lua, rainha do astral, rainha das alturas, rainha celestial, rainha mamãe pura, rainha universal, rainha das águas, rainha do mar, rainha de todos, ela é quem vem nos curar, rainha Iemanjá, rainha Iemanjá, rainha Iemanjá. Ravi, I actually had an insight about something while I was singing that song just now, which is a kind of another layer of understanding or interpretation of what this question of whether you're writing a song or receiving a song. Because I was remembering the story about how Paul McCartney received the song Yesterday. And then if you've heard the story, he woke with it fully formed in his mind. He dreamed the song. And of course it went on to be his most covered song. It's probably one of the most well-known songs. And then I'm thinking about Bach, who used to write his scores with quite often without any rough sketches. He would write orchestral parts. Like when he wrote his cantatas out, he went through a period of his life when he had to compose a new cantata to be performed in church every week or every 2 weeks. I don't know the exact details of that, but what he would do was, rather than sketch out a piece and in score form, as you normally would if you're writing an orchestral piece, you'd write out a piano score and then you kind of flesh it out into an orchestral score, and when you're ready to give the parts to the musicians, then you would write out the first violin part in neat and the second violin part and the oboe part, and then those parts are ready to give to the performers and the conductor as the score. What Bach used to do quite often was he would not have any score or any sketches. He would just sit down and, copying the music out of his mind, he would write the first violin part out in neat and put it to one side and then do this. And he's obviously copying from something that's kind of like imprinted in his mind. And so I was thinking about this and thinking, it's not only in plant spirit medicine situations or spiritual contexts that people receive songs. Of course, in popular music or classical music, people are having similar experiences. And I suppose the insight I had just now is that for me, it took that many years and that long journey of going through all those different forms of music and musical experience before I could find myself in a place where I could have that pure experience of being in touch with the spirit of music, that I could receive something so fully formed and with such a sense of a pure connection to the source. Because I think when I was a classical composer, I always felt inadequate because I thought, I'm struggling too much to make this happen. I'm rummaging around in my mind. I'm, spending hours making sketches and trying things out. And where's this kind of like impulse to just tune in and receive? And so it's ironic that actually it was within the medicine music world that I had that experience and was able to open to that experience. But I don't think it's by any means unique to that musical setting.
I remember once somebody talking about, I was living in Italy at the time, and there was a musician friend of mine who was also a sculptor, and he met an old sculptor, an old Italian, well-known, renowned sculptor, and it was just a certain phrase that he used after he met him, and he said that the light of creativity was still in his eyes. And there's something about the artist's way, there's a certain light of creativity, there's a certain light you can recognise in all the greatest that we have come to sort of, that we've all learnt from, as it were. Shall we come to, I'd like to come to bring up the subject of the instrument that you've become synonymous with or known for, which is the shakuhachi. It's important to bring it into the conversation. And if you can give us an introduction and maybe a demonstration as well.
Yeah, sure. So the shakuhachi is a bamboo flute. It's made from the natural bamboo. These are the nodes, they're called fushi in Japanese. And these are the roots where the bamboo, that much of it would grow underground and it would have these long roots. So it's a very natural instrument. It's existed in this form for a very, very long time. Because it has 4 notes on the front and 1 hole on the back, it plays a 5-note scale, which in its simple form is like this. And then up the octave. However, the Japanese scale doesn't use only these closed hole notes. It uses 3/4 holes and a quarter holes and half holes to produce different tones like this. So a Japanese scale, when I play it, you'll probably instantly recognize it. That sounds Japanese. So a Japanese scale would be more like this. Now what you notice is that the half holes, they have a very soft muted tone. If I try to play a strong tone on that note, you just lose the sound. So you have to drop the breath pressure and change your embouchure and change the angle that you blow into the flute, as well as just having a very specific 3/4 or 1/4 hole shape there. So that gives you this scale that's almost like chiaroscuro. It has this sense of light and shade built into it. The first scale I played, you can imagine in primary colours, every note is very bright. The second scale has this idea of some notes are bright and some are more muted. And so this is something unique to the shakuhachi in that the melodies the instrument plays, the traditional melodies, are not so much about different pitches, they're more about different colours, and the colours are associated with different ways of breathing into the instrument. And the instrument comes from a certain monastic tradition in Japan where monks of the Zen Buddhist school, one particular school called the Fuke school, the monks of that school of Zen Buddhism used the shakuhachi as part of their daily practice. And they played long notes on it, and they played melodies, and they developed this instrument as a way of developing concentration and breath control, and linked to practices of awareness and mindfulness and other elements associated with Zen practice or meditation practice. And so a fairly sophisticated repertoire of pieces grew up over hundreds of years that were never heard outside of this context. It was never intended for performance or entertainment. And I was in my mid-20s when I heard some of this music, and it completely blew me away. And I felt I have to learn this instrument. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. In fact, the music kind of gave me like an electric shock. It was so powerful when I first heard it. And I contacted, what I actually did was the first time I heard this flute was on a record, a 12-inch vinyl record. I was listening on headphones in the music library in the Barbican, and the first sound of the piece came out like this. What I played you was the opening phrase of the oldest shakuhachi piece, which in the tradition I learned from is called Honshirabi. And listening to that, I just felt like something very sort of alien and never experienced before, but at the same time it was very familiar, like in the heart, and it just drew me. And I wrote to the teacher, I wrote to the player who was playing on that particular record. I tracked his address down and wrote to him and said, if I come to Japan, will you teach me? And he wrote back. It was the day before internet, so you had to write a letter. I got a Japanese friend, to translate the letter into Japanese and sent it to him. And before I knew it, I was actually living in Japan and having lessons with this guy. And then I stayed for 7 years. I had no intention to do that, but that's what happened. And the shakuhachi is a very unique sound, partly because of the sound it makes and the techniques used to play it, but also because it was never an instrument that was intended to be expressive of something for a listener. It's more an instrument that's designed to accompany a very disciplined and deep and nuanced journey of self-inquiry and exploration of all the classic kind of existential questions about the nature of life and death, and the Buddhist teachings are all basically about how to escape suffering, how to liberate yourself from suffering, and so the shakuhachi exists in that kind of quite profound context in a way because it comes from a Zen Buddhist tradition. So I was drawn to that as much as I was to the music, and but at the same time, because I arrived there in Japan with this background of having played so many other kinds of music, as soon as I could play the instrument a little bit, I started playing Celtic melodies. I'll play you one of the first Celtic tunes that I learned to play on this instrument. It's an Irish tune by the composer O'Carolan, who wrote a lot of beautiful slow.
O'Carolan, yeah.
It's called this tune's called Amen Aconoic. if I can just share, I know you probably got loads of questions, but if I can just share one other thing about this instrument, which is for me the most significant aspect of it, which is when I played that note, then the last note, and the note died away to silence, that is something that I've been really deeply studying and practicing, about how to make a note fade away to silence so imperceptibly. Like if you strike a bell and the sound dies away without any human effort, it's just the sound of the bell. And to replicate that is something, because it's a human playing it, because I'm breathing into it, and then the listener is aware that I'm actually sustaining that note, and the ear, as the note dies away, the ear kind of opens up to follow where the sound is going. And then when the note finishes and you find yourself in silence, it's the nature of the silence is transformed. Something's opened up. And this is a physical thing, because our ear is a sense organ, but it's something more than that. The ear is a portal to some aspects of awareness or consciousness, which also become opened. And so in that way, you can see how this practice of this instrument and working with it in that way could have a deeper significance. And this way that the flute is able to actually change the sound and the feeling of the silence in the room. It's like you can play the most beautiful melodies on this instrument, but it's what happens after the melody finishes that is important, and that's linked to a lot of other aspects of Japanese spiritual practice, martial arts and crafts, this idea of the space between things. They're called the ma in Japanese, and the idea that when you're doing something, it's not so much the thing you're doing that is important, but the awareness and the space that surrounds the action or the intention that you're fulfilling.
I think also how certain artists, part of what they're offering to audiences or participants in an event, a music event, is they're partly educating as well, helping people to understand that interaction between music and silence, so it becomes a transformational experience. I also wanted to say, of course, the piece you just played, Carolyn, is, of course, a very prolific, famous composer from maybe around the same time, actually, a link between...
Yeah, so 17th, 18th century. But he was blind, so his hearing must have been even that much more attuned.
So, well, thank you, and let's come back to songs.
Yeah.
And again, that different circumstances in which one receives, or however you want to describe it, songs. I think the next song has got a very significant story, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I suppose, because of my musical background, as I mentioned, when I started receiving songs, it felt like a unique experience. But also, I was never a singer. I played all these instruments, but I was never the singer in the band. I never sang in choirs. And I was never a guitar player. I played the piano, I played percussion, I played trumpet, violin, anything you could think of, but never a guitar player. So I associate these medicine songs of mine with singing and playing the guitar as much as I do with receiving them. And I never sing these, for a long time. Things are changing now because the sort of general context within which people listening to music has changed, both online and live. But I never used to sing these songs anywhere outside of ceremonies. And so they had this sort of I was almost like protective of them. But something happened when the time that my mother passed away, which is I had this experience that was not connected directly to ceremony, but was a very similar sense of I was tuning in and being transported and being invited to receive some kind of message through musical form. And it was linked directly to the passing of my mother. She passed away 11 years ago, and I was sitting by her bedside when she passed away. And I felt her take a last breath. And I was sitting very quietly and peacefully with her. I had one hand on her heart and one hand on her crown chakra, because I'd read in the teachings of Ramana Maharshi that he did that when his own mother passed away. and that apparently is the best way to help a soul leave the body and go on its way. So I just, without any planning, I found myself doing that. And I'm sitting there, and she takes her last breath, and as she goes off somewhere beyond the veil, I kind of follow her. And I'm with her, and I see some things of what she's seeing. And then I realize I have to come back. And I come back, and I'm back sitting on the chair next to her body. And I have this song fully formed in my mind that somehow seemed to express something about my, the way that I was able to experience some frequency connected to what she had just gone through leaving her body. She wasn't a religious person, and I wouldn't describe myself as religious either, although I'm very drawn to sacred traditions of different kinds. But something happened in that moment, like a kind of penetrating the veil almost, and then the music was the bridge or the communicator that sort of crystallized that experience. So that's the song I'd like to sing for you.
Great.
Beautiful bird flying in the sky on the wings of eternal love. Spirit of freedom, the spirit of light, beautiful bird flying through the sky on the wings of eternal love.
Quite a collection of songs now within your repertoire now, and so you're manifesting this into this body of work in various recorded forms. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, it's a relatively new venture for me, and it's taken me a long time to feel comfortable with it. As a professional musician and someone who's always had some kind of profile as a musician doing gigs ever since I was a teenager, there is this feeling that you need to get it out there. You need to do gigs, you need to publicise the gigs, you need to sell tickets for gigs, you need to make recordings, you need to get people to listen to your music. And that can be for a variety of reasons, but generally it's because people believe that what they have to offer is of value and they want to share it. Or it's because they feel that their mission is to be a performer and they want to communicate or express something. And so that side of music making has always been kind of familiar to me, although I'm not one of those people that feels intimately comfortable on a stage. I just have this necessity to do gigs and recordings because it's my life. When it comes to medicine songs, I was always very coy and careful about blurring the two worlds, and so anything that I did publicly in terms of performances or online presence would be very clearly about musical activities that have nothing to do with these medicine ceremonies, because that felt too intimate, too kind of from a different world, a private world, really. And of course it's populated with lots of other people, and some of those people become good friends, so it's not private in the sense you're just by yourself, but it's private in the way that it's not for the general public. But over the years, people have sort of encouraged me more and more to get into a different way of looking and feeling about it, to share the songs. And also the times are changing, and there's a genre now called medicine music, which didn't exist a few years ago. And medicine music is to understand music of indigenous peoples from contexts in which plant spirit medicines or devotional practices connecting to sacred traditions are being used, but also new music received by people by myself. And there's a crossover. There are people like myself who say, well, I'm receiving this music, I'm not composing it, because I just feel it that way. And there are other people that are spending time with indigenous people in the forest, and they're exposed to different sacred ceremonies and rituals, and they already have some experience as a songwriter, but then they feel that experience kind of morphs into a different sort of chapter of their life almost, where they become more able to listen and tune into spirit. And so I find myself in this sort of 21st century environment where people are receiving songs and learning songs and sharing songs from sacred traditions and from medicine circles. And so I'm just kind of going along with that and allowing myself to put some of the same energy that I would have put into promoting some of my other recordings and concerts, to just really share this music. And I feel more and more it's a real calling to do that, because the songs contain teachings which come from the forest, and they come from the astral, and they come from our own deepest wisdom, which is sometimes muted and obscured by conditioned layers of understanding and thinking and feeling that don't allow us to feel some more like primal truths that we're born with and that lie at the core of all the spiritual traditions. And then to be able to kind of expose ourselves to that inner wisdom, which is ancient wisdom, is at the same time as being contemporary, and then to share that, it starts to feel more like a gift and a blessing rather than something that should be kind of kept sheltered. So I find myself in that process, and it's by no means clear. There's a lot of ambiguity for me still about how it really feels to share these kinds of songs, but I'm basically surrendered to the process at the moment and working on different albums and recording projects to allow the songs to really kind of come to life with beautiful musicians and singers and arrangements.
I think we've been around long enough to see there's been many movements that have started grassroots, underground, until eventually they just have to be shared. And I think this is a classic example of that. And there's so many, also being aware of this particular movement, with this particular musical movement, that it feels like it's got to this point of really blossoming, and it just has to come out. And there's so many, from many different sources, a lot of, there's a real explosion of creativity. And
I feel in my own songs that a lot of the messages of the songs, I'll just sing you the first verse of another one of my songs. So this song actually, a lot of my songs incorporate mantras from different traditions, and then there's new English words around them. So this mantra is a Japanese mantra. Nobo akya shakya rabaya mari kya mari Nobo akya shakya rabaya So that mantra, Nobo Akyasakya Rabaya, on Arikyamari, is it's the mantra of a Buddhist bodhisattva called Kokuzo, who is considered to be the lord of the treasury of empty, infinite space. And he's guarding the purity of the infinite vastness from which everything else manifests, rises and falls. And so that mantra is, and that way of kind of connecting with the deity or entity or spirit of Kokuzo is connected to this phrase that a lot of people know, emptiness is form and form is emptiness. It's the idea that nothing exists in a permanent state. Everything rises and falls from emptiness. And so when I received the English words to this song, they came like this. Boundless space is the ground of being, wherein all phenomena rise and fall. Boundless space is the ground of being, wherein all phenomena rise and fall. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Nobo akya shakya rabai. And then it's off into the mantra. So the reason I wanted to just share that as a kind of illustration of a feeling that I have, which is that, I spent my life searching for the answers to all the sort of big questions, like many other people. And quite often the most profound answers are found in the most ancient teachings, but they're still the most urgent questions and the most urgent answers. And so what's needed always is new forms in which old wisdom can become available to people. So rather than just chanting a Buddhist mantra in the way it's been done for hundreds of years, if you take that mantra and you take some English songs that expound upon the meaning of the mantra and the significance of it, and put it in a song that everybody can sing along with simple lines that repeat, I feel like somehow it's like being guided to do this, because these teachings need to be heard.
Actually, I wanted to bring that up because, as you know, my particular passion of the last couple of years that's come to the fore is creating vehicles to help support people to sing, which is, of course, related to these kind of songs and other kind of songs. And I know that you're supporting that as well, creating that vehicle, that possibility, that safe space for people to sing, which of course I have discovered is really important for our times, particularly at the moment.
Yeah, well, the act of collective singing has so many different aspects and layers to it. I mean, you have people feeling empowered to find their voice in a collective context. It feels safe, and then everybody inspires everybody. It's a kind of knock-on effect, and the voices can really lift up. And also on a kind of physiological level, singing kind of stimulates the blood vessels in the lungs and around the heart. So that kind of opens the heart, and that's the most important thing that we all need to do in this time, is open our hearts, because the world can be quite brutal, and there's a lot of cynicism and kind of things around that is difficult sometimes to navigate through, and the world can seem threatening, and so we naturally close up, and then that makes things more difficult. And so how to feel in a safe way to open the heart and really just soften a little bit and feel what that feels like and feel the benefits of that and have that as a practice. Singing is so good for that, and people in choirs are always so happy. They're the happiest people, and there's an amazing sense of combination of creativity and lyricism and connectivity and empowerment and healing, and it's a very wonderful thing to be part of a movement like that, where singing is the core activity.
And which has been around forever, as long as we've been humans.
Before instruments were made. That's the frame.
Great. Well, thank you, Adrian. It's been wonderful to have you in the Songwriter series. Let's close out with some music.
Yeah. Okay. Hey Jude.
Do you know that one?
I think probably safer to go with our chorus, Shakuhachi Jazz.
Yeah, good idea.
So I brought 3 shakuhachis along to show you today. I played this one initially, and it's a kind of mid-range shakuhachi. This one, you see they're all completely different because they're just made from natural bamboo. It's a bit smaller. And then I've got this one, which is... Oh, I was going to play with you, but I just realised it's a different key. Anyway, you're worth a look. This is a bass shakuhachi. So, okay. Over to you.